Hello, I'd like to talk to you today for a few minutes about kind of a subject that I've called errors in the Bible. I've titled it that here. I've got a lot of the videos, and what it does is it take a passage from the New Testament that references the Old Testament, look at the Old Testament reference, compare the two, see if it's valid, and by that I can say that's an error. So I invite you to go look at those videos. And here what's different is it's just things that are pointedly stated in the Bible that most people don't believe. So it's not, it kind of points to an error. And I'm not going to say what the error is. I'm just going to highlight some things here just to get people thinking. In James chapter 2 verse 24, it talks about how a man is very specifically justified by works and not by faith only. And that whole chapter is dedicated to that. It's not ambiguous. It's not, he might have meant something else. It's very, very plain, and it's noteworthy that he used Abraham and Rahab as examples of people who were justified by works, and as opposed to being justified by their faith. He was specifically said they're justified by works. Another example that would agree with James would be found in Matthew chapter 16 verse 27. He shall, just as an excerpt, he shall reward every man according to his works. I believe that's Jesus speaking there. If you look for the opposing view, you'll find it is mostly Pauline. And there's a lot of examples, and a few of them you can find in Romans chapter 4, where it says that Abraham was justified by faith and not by works. In Galatians chapter 3, it's the same thing. Abraham was justified by faith and not by works. And it goes on and on. It don't just talk about Abraham. It just talks about, that's an example he uses. And there's the ever popular Ephesians 2, 8 and 9, for by grace are you saved through faith, and this not of yourselves, and so on. In Hebrews chapter 11, we don't know if most people don't think Paul wrote this, but whatever the case, it's interesting because this chapter is also saying that a person is saved, justified by faith, and it uses Abraham and Rahab as examples of people who were justified by their faith and not by their works. Again, I mentioned in James it uses Abraham and Rahab just the same, and it says no, they were justified by works, not by faith. So that's a contrast that most people, or a lot of Protestants don't believe. Fundamentally, Protestants do not believe that a man is justified by works. Works are irrelevant in justification to Protestants. And it also is a note, Martin Luther, which is one of the exponents of the Protestant Reformation, back in the 16th century, he was one of the people who said you're justified by faith. He agreed with what Paul said, and so whenever it came to James, what James said, instead of necessarily explaining it away, he relegated it to an appendix to his Bible. He just kind of pushed it aside. Moving on, John chapter 2 verse 23 talks about the forgiveness of sins. What do people typically believe about the forgiveness of sins? Who can forgive sin? We can forgive, like if my wife does something, I can forgive her. But if we talk about forgiveness on a higher level, on a higher plane, what can we do? So in John chapter 20 verse 23, we find a verse that says, whosoever sins ye remit. He's talking to his disciples, I believe here. Whosoever sins ye remit, they are remitted unto them. And whosoever sins ye retain, they are retained. So not only does it says that they can forgive sins, it says they can hold sins or whatever. So I don't know if there's a lot of people who believe that. Except, it's a Protestants don't believe it, but Catholics use that verse in regard to justifying their practice of the confessions. So the priest, you confess to the priest, and the priest forgives their sins. So that is the context in which significant people take that, understandably so. generally I'm not saying what verse is right and what verse is wrong. I'm just pointing out differences, and this is just a difference in what people think. And I have to apologize, but in the Psalms, you probably could do a search and look it up pretty easily. But there's a passage in the Psalms that says that God hates all evildoers, and that's typically something that people don't believe. That, He loves everybody. He loves all the wicked people. But it says pointedly in the Psalms that He hates all evildoers. Again, moving on. The topic of baptism. Is baptism necessary for salvation? Talk to a Protestant, they'll say no. Talk to a Catholic, they'll say yes. What does a Catholic use for his basis of saying yes? And one passage that he would use would be 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21, where it says that baptism doth also now save us. Now, being open-minded and reading the whole passage around it, what it says is, I don't think it's, you can't run out and grab somebody and dunk them and say, okay, now you're going to go to heaven. That's not necessarily the point. The point was, and when Protestants talk about it, they'll basically say that, it's not that baptism saves you. What it is that Peter makes it clear here even that, it's what Jesus did in His death on the cross that saved you. But now, that may be well and fine, but if you read what he said, what he very clearly appears to be saying is that baptism is the necessary means by which you accept this thing that he says is going to save you. It's necessary. So if people just read this and they say no, baptism is not necessary, I believe that is disagreeing with what it says in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21. Again, baptism doth also now save us. And Peter is recorded in Acts and other places talking about, believe and be baptized. Baptism seemed to be an important aspect of salvation for him. And another passage that's not from Peter, it's Jesus speaking, supposedly. In Mark chapter 16, verse 16, it says something to the effect of, he who believes and is baptized will be saved. It says and, very clearly and a couple more in Mark, just a couple of verses later after that one. Mark 16:18, it talks about people taking up serpents and drinking things that are deadly and it won't hurt them and stuff like that. And I would say that most people by far don't believe that. And so these are just a few things in the Bible that people don't believe, not necessarily saying what's right and what's wrong, but they don't believe it. Some of which you can find as a dividing line between Catholics and Protestants. So my point here is to try to understand this Bible a little bit better. I'm assuming I'm talking to a Christian here. And you need, one of the first things I think to really understanding your religion is understanding that the Bible is not inerrant. It does contain errors, it does contain contradiction, it does contain things that you don't even believe. So I know this is a hard thing. It seems like a taboo even to talk about it, but I would encourage you to think clearly, because the realm of what's right and what's wrong is fixed. It doesn't change based on someone admitting that their Bible isn't inerrant, and you can't count on every single passage. You can't pick one passage out and stand on it and say, I'm right and you're wrong because of this one passage. What you have is a book that's got a lot of good things in it, but it's got some bad in it too. And you need to come to the point where you can judge matters of normal human sentiment, and but in the end, it's a matter of what you believe. And so I just invite you to go back over these passages and see what you think for yourself.